big strong man, Uncle Sam, need your help again. Got himself in a terrible jam, way down yonder in Vietnam. Put down your books and pick up a gun, we're gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Now come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. Why, man, this is war a go-go. There's plenty good money to be made, supplying the army with the tools of the trade. Just hope and pray we have to drop the bomb and drop it on the Vietcong. And it's
good evening, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 425, January 25th, 1980, and it's side 1.
It's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die.
That song was recorded at Woodstock, summer 1969, by Country Joe and the Fish. It makes fun of the Wall Street prophets of war and the generals and the motivations for sending people off to war. The unfortunate thing is that the Woodstock generation dispersed and got involved in the me generation instead of studying the consequences of the war with the same energy that they fought the draft. The assembly of large masses of young people was to fight going off to Vietnam, but when Vietnam was over, they didn't continue the studies or the energy considering the rest of the world that could be raped or murdered by the same people. They then went into what became known as the me generation, the hot tub, macrame, self-delivery of your own babies, an awareness of the individual's body and the foods, which is fine, the concern for ecology, but not studying the very same generals and the news media and the propaganda machine that gave them one war, and now 10 years later they're faced with another war. My objection to a lot of the political activism of the 60s was that as the assassinations and murders became evident and obvious, and the people that were doing them were gaining in political power in this country, that these same activists, the Vietnam veterans against the war and so forth, dropped out. Their biggest political activity is to check out their own poisonings for Agent Orange or their physical disabilities and disadvantages, that they're not getting the same shake that other veterans got after other wars. But stop wars, no, they've never worked to continue as a large group. The so-called left or the activists of the 60s simply dropped out, and all of a sudden they wake up 10 years later with a new war in the Middle East, and not new faces, the same people making another war, only in a different place. Political activism will rise up again, particularly as Jimmy Carter gets the youth signed up, ready for conscription, but they're also meeting places such as in Utah and Nevada, where people are objecting to having the MX missile located on their ground, and I think we're going to see a resurgence of people on the streets, and hopefully they will someday not meet individual problems, their single problems, but will reach out and see their problems as part of a world problem and try to understand the history of our times, particularly since the end of World War I, and why we get into these troubles in the first place. My shows, the radio broadcasts from KLRB, were played in Utah for a long time, and there's a station now that's going to resume playing them on the air. So for all of you people there, young or old, we're following the effect of the MX missile. This is a multi-billion-dollar project, $33 billion actually, for the MX missile in Utah and Nevada. The area was selected because, in quotes, it was just a worthless desert for deploying missiles. This is from the New York Times, where it actually is a delicate ecological balance that supports ranchers and herders. Now, the problem that the people are complaining about in these cities and meeting in large masses is that there'll be more people, more crime, and more pollution, not to speak of the deadly pollution. But the main thing is that the MX missile is like the Maginot Line that separated France and Germany. It will actually serve no purpose, and by the time it is assembled, as I say, the $33 billion project, it will not be useful to the defense of the United States. I don't believe it will. And who would want it on the soil? And the consequences are so tremendous that you people just can't even begin to feel the pain. The government, the Air Force, just sent in a $1 million check to a Western Regional Commission for Utah and Nevada to study the environmental studies of the MX. It's good for business, it solves unemployment, and it keeps everybody filled with a lot of energy of construction. But I am sure that there's people in these states and cities that realize that the entire tone of this country will change, as well as the pollution and disease and the consequences of having this there. And right now they are meeting politically to preserve their open spaces and confronting some of the problems that they will face once the Army moves into Utah and Nevada. I'm not going to comment about President Carter's speech. As I say on these tapes over and again, he's a graduate of Annapolis. He's a military man. He was shrouded with a protective cloak. The broad smile and the teeth, Greg Allman and the rock bands, and Barbara Jordan, the black woman, and Mr. Lipsitch, the Jewish lawyer, while the Bilderbergers, Prince Bernhardt, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Wall Street clique put him into office, and then within 3 years he shed his cloaks, and he is anxious to set up troops and arms to control, if we could, which I don't believe we can, the Middle East, the Persian Gulf. And if we succeed to foul that up like we did Vietnam, and the 80s are the year for refugees and huge waste of money and contracts in the Middle East, then 20 years from there they go to South Africa, and then maybe another 10 years they'll be in the United States fighting on our soil. We'll be fighting each other. That's all I see from this continuous feeding of arms. The Washington Post, January 13th, has a wonderful article called The Iranian Arms Bazaar, and it has to do with a blue water base that costs $8 billion that the Shah wanted in the Indian Ocean. When you read the people that are making the contracts over in Iran, you can see how angry they are about the hostages and how delicate they are to not go in and make war and anger the Iranian people, because eventually they hope to continue using Iran as a buffer to fight the Soviet Union someday. And the same people that made the war in Southeast Asia have moved their contracts over to the Middle East, and they'll continue to make more. The CIA is going to go full scale with anything it wants, and the arms merchants will too. The Iranian Arms Bazaar article from the Washington Post has estimated costs. It has different projects they were making: the Ibex, the Sikh Entry, the Chabahar, Peace Log, the F-14, the F-16, the Spruance Class 993, the Sikh Switch, and the helicopters. And these are the corporations. Ibex is a CIA monitoring system, supposed to be the largest of the whole area that could monitor the Soviet Union, Turkey, Afghanistan. $500 million has been put into it. The companies building it are Rockwell International, Watkins Johnson, Hewlett-Packard, E-Systems, and iTech. The Sikh Entry is a computerized air defense system, costs $120 million plus. AWACS is airborne radar systems mounted on Boeing 707s. The estimated cost would be $15 billion, and the companies are Westinghouse, Hughes Organization, Texas Instruments, and Boeing. The Chabahar was an $8 billion project built by Brown and Root, the same company that built the Tiger cages and the cement for the air landing strips for Vietnam. A lot of that stock is owned by Lady Bird Johnson, widow of Lyndon Johnson. Their family accrues a lot from Brown and Root. Of course, the Hughes Organization with Robert Mayo and the CIA was the umbrella for the assassination teams that kill the candidates and people that make the arms merchants possible, that you get the warfare state in place of those people who would coexist with the Soviet Union and de-escalate this war. That Peace Log is a project, automated logistics, at a cost of $350 million by Lockheed Aircraft. The F-14's $2.3 billion project for 80 airplanes, built by Grumman Corporation, one at Long Island, and 77 of these were for Iran. They're all grounded now. F-16's $3.6 billion project of 160 aircraft by General Dynamics. Of course, the Henry Crown, General Dynamics, Albert Jenner connections to the Kennedy assassination. I've done tapes on that. Each one of these huge corporations had a part or a finger in the assassination umbrella network that killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and they're going on for bigger oceans now and control of the world. But these were contracts for F-16s for General Dynamics, $3.6 billion. The Spruance Class 993 destroyers cost $2 billion. These are contracts for Iran. The Iranian Arms Bazaar, built by Litton Industries, the company that overthrew as a cover for the Greek military junta, Roy Ashton Litton Industries in 1967, put in the Greek military junta and the Nazis back into power. Luckily, the Greeks were able to overthrow them within a 7-year period, but this dictatorship was put in by the CIA just as we put the Shah of Iran in. And Seek Switch, which is an automated upgrading of Iran's national radio and telephone communication systems, it cost several $1 billion by American Telephone and Telegraph subsidiary Peace Crown Military System. $200 million into that, the communications, radio, and telephone. And then the helicopters, a series of commercial and government deals for 1,000 helicopters at a cost of $1.8 billion, built by Bell Helicopter. And, of course, I've done tapes on Bell Helicopter, and Mr. Miller, the Secretary of the Treasury right now, being in head of Bell Helicopter. And, of course, each one of these corporations, Bell Helicopter, AT&T, Litton Industries, the General Dynamics, Grumman, the Hughes, the Lockheed, Westinghouse, Texas Instrument, Boeing, Hewlett-Packard, E-Systems, iTech, Rockwell International, have on their payroll, all of them, German Nazi scientists that came over here to do microwave satellites, communications, missile systems. They were part of Adolf Hitler's army. They were used and created by Adolf Hitler, and they were brought over to this country in Project Paperclip. Those 642 experts have been dispersed among all these corporations that are making multi-billion-dollar contracts, and of course the taxpayer pays for it. The wars are our family and sons, husbands, brothers, uncles, you name it, men and women that have to fight these wars, and the weapons are built and purchased by these various countries, built in America. So it's very necessary that Jimmy Carter make overtures to Iran and stay calm, because the main thing is that we would have a depression if we didn't keep making these weapon systems, and because we're building for that war in 1985, we have to have the Iranian arms bazaar going. It controls the whole Middle East. You can't really blame the Soviet Union for running into little Afghanistan at a time that our hostages are being held and we're at bay, because if the Soviet Union feels a war is imminent, maybe they're going to push it now before the arms bazaar escalates again. January the 11th, on tape 423, I went into the arrest of Frank Terpil of the CIA and George Korkola from New Jersey, his partner, and their arrest at the Hilton Hotel in New York City. This is a story that is still very suppressed, and I want to update this information about the arms merchants that has come out. Just there's been several articles, and not a lot. All that I have from around the country are 2 articles from the New York Times. There was an article January the 11th, 1980. This is an article. The lead story is indicted ex-CIA employee labeled by prosecutor as a major world arms dealer remains an enigma. The writer from Washington, D.C. for the New York Times referred to Frank Terpil as an enigma. For those of you who don't have those past tapes, I'm not going back to fill you up on this. These are just briefly men that have been arrested who are linked to international arms that are funding what is known as the Third World, which is really tied up to Adolf Hitler's money in order to get Iraq, Syria, the Palestinian Liberation Group, and Idi Amin's Uganda. And when Amin was out, the money still can keep rolling in for weapons. The so-called Third World is funded by men from the CIA and from United States corporations in France, Great Britain, the United States, to assist us eventually to gang up against the Soviet Union. The New York Times article, as I say, referred to Terpil as an enigma. James McCord and E. Howard Hunt were enigmas when they were arrested at Watergate. They'd worked for the CIA for 19 and 21 years, and they were supposed to be made as little bumbling gumshoes, the Keystone Cops, until James McCord started talking. These people have important connections, and the word enigma put out by the media is just to make you think there are no answers to what they're doing, but the answers are there. If there were some journalists out there pushing the story, the answers are there. This New York Times article talks about the business office 2020 Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., next door to the Icelandic Embassy, across the street from the Maltese Chancery. It's an American base for Frank Terpil. It's owned by Capital Investments. It's not owned by Terpil at all, and now it turns out that it's a Liberian corporation, but the names of the people who run it are not listed. Of course, Daniel Ludwig in Brazil, an American citizen who lives in Brazil, who's going to leave his money to Switzerland, to a medical institute for cancer, has his tankers under the Liberian flag, as does Aristotle Onassis. And again, going back to the Nazi international corporations, the oil tankers are listed in Liberia, and this building is owned by Capital Investment. The land record shows it was bought in 1977 for $210,000, and then was first under Terpil's name and then, in quotes, erroneously conveyed, actually owned by Capital Investment. The home that Mr. Terpil lives in McLean, Virginia, is less than 1 mile from the Central Intelligence Agency. He worked for the CIA, for the National Security Agency, for the Army, spying and coding, classifications, and radar work. His home is also listed by Capital Investments of Virginia, Incorporated. The one building is in Virginia over several $100,000 and a $20,000 swimming pool. The office is in Washington, D.C. The Capital Investment in Washington owns the office, the Capital Investment in Virginia, the home, and yet they're not listed in any corporation or partnership records in Virginia or the District of Columbia, according to the New York Times article. The building and the business and the home and real estate have been involved for the past 3 years, 1977, 78, and 79, but this doesn't clear up the mystery of the men. Jimmy Carter came to Washington after the 1976 elections, and these men linked to Libya, weapons to Libya, to Gaddafi, and of course Billy Carter and Robert Vesco, and that can of worms is linked down to the Libyan government and to Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter's problems are being hushed up in regard to the investigations of these connections. They're going on right now in Washington, just as the Burt Lance case is going on in down in Georgia, and the Hamilton Jordan cocaine grand jury investigation is being hushed up now. There's a can of worms of the Carters to these very people that are being investigated, and this is the reason I think it's being hushed up. These men were arraigned in New York City, charged with conspiracy, criminal possession of weapons, and other charges, and they'll appear again January 31st in the New York State Supreme Court. The Washington investigation, the grand jury investigation, was going into Frank Terpil a while back under possible violation of Foreign Agents Registration Act and Munitions Control Act. I mentioned on the tape 2 weeks ago the OCEANIC International Corporation, that Washington-based concern that Frank Terpil works out. It's also headquarters for a company called Technology Transfer Group. And they're separate. They're listed as separate companies, but they have interchangeable men and employees for both of them. And Michael L. Enfant, president of Oceanic, said that the charges about Terpil are too far-fetched and unbelievable, that they're wild stories that exaggerate his activities in Africa, but that he is a consultant and representative and that he travels overseas, and that his job is to sell foreign governments and companies and armies boats, generators, fire engines, and other U.S. products. He also is supposed to have sold $3.2 million worth of weapons to Idi Amin in Uganda, but Mr. Enfant says, infant mentality maybe, that he was selling uniforms and musical instruments to Idi Amin. So that Uganda must have a wonderful orchestra right now in uniforms if they got $3.2 million worth of uniforms and musical instruments. I'm not aware that much music is coming out of there except screaming. The Oceanic International and the Technology Transfer Group are both owned, as I say, by Capital Investments Limited, which is a Liberian corporation. A man who used to be treasurer of Oceanic, who resigned, and you remember, many of you remember the Watergate stories. As soon as somebody was suspect or linked for a group, they would say a former member, they resigned. A Mr. Don Randall was interviewed for the New York Times, and he said that Mr. Terpil's business for Oceanic was pretty doggone vague, that he came back with a lot of money. Somebody put up the money, It was always a legitimate business, and if Mr. Terpil did anything improper, he did it without the company's knowledge. Well, you can work for the National Security Agency and the CIA and send weapons all over the world and assassination weapons and silencers, and that wouldn't be considered improper. It may be considered national security, just as the Shah of Iran had collars with electricity or garrots to choke off people's necks. He didn't think that was improper. He thought that was for interrogation techniques. So the word improper used in the New York Times is interesting and typical of the way the news media carries things. But there was this money, and they didn't know where it was coming from, and it's international. And Mr. Randall said that he was mystified by Terpil's overseas activities and that he himself didn't share in the profits that Terpil was reaping. Of course, he earned a living at the corporation, and we don't know what he was doing. And he may have considered $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 earning a living. We don't know if he made $20,000 or $200,000. He disassociates himself. Another woman, Laura Ripley, used to be a vice president of OCEANIC. I remember James McCord's wife was on the board of directors of McCord Associates when he, in quotes, left the CIA and still worked for the CIA and security of the White House. Laura Ripley said, "I used to see a lot of money floating around the office. I left in 1978 when I was disillusioned in October 78, and claimed that the cash flow suddenly stopped because of violations of human rights in Uganda, that the weapon flow, the money from Uganda wasn't coming in." But that doesn't explain what they were doing in the office. As a matter of fact, Laura Ripley said in the New York Times article that Mr. Frank Terpil had CIA connections, and I was under the impression that Mr. Terpil was reporting to the CIA even while he was in Uganda. While he was in Uganda, he reported to the CIA, which would mean, you know, that the CIA was giving material weapons to Libya, Uganda, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and reporting back to the CIA that this interchange of money and weapons was flowing back and forth. The people working for OCEANIC, some of them, moved away from the organization, although they admit there was all this money, and the organization was the home of Mr. Terpil was just one block from the Central Intelligence Agency. Now this Frank Terpil's wife, Marilyn, worked for the CIA, worked in past tense. Of course, as soon as somebody is arrested, the CIA has what they call disassociation or disavowal. That's one of the conditions of working for the intelligence community, is that you get picked up or arrested. They don't know you anymore. You're out on your own. And Mrs. Terpil was a makeup artist, or is, for the Central Intelligence Agency. As soon as he was arrested, it's the past tense for the New York Times, but she could be working up to the day he was arrested at the Hilton Hotel in New York City. Here was Terpil with all of his contacts of the intelligence community, and his wife was a makeup artist, or is, for the CIA. Frank Terpil also worked, according to the New York Times article, for police and law enforcement groups that OCEANIC International Corporation, a technology transfer group owned by this Liberian corporation, not listed in Virginia or Washington, made for local governments and schools and hospitals what they call French boots or Denver boots. And those are devices used to immobilize illegally parked cars. There's a recent article on how the Soviets took over Afghanistan, and they had some kind of nails or something in the roadway that stopped the vehicles from moving, the tanks and so forth, to move while they came in. And yet I know we have these made, and they may be even dispersed to our local police departments in the event of riots or martial law, that you immobilize cars or trucks so that people can't get from one place to the other. Again, the same link of Terpil to E. Howard Hunt and James McCord at the time of planned martial law in 1972, or a possible military takeover. E. Howard Hunt, at the time of his arrest at Watergate, had maps of Washington, D.C., and the main arteries all blocked off, and James McCord was in charge of the 16-man unit military control in the event that they took over the government, the security of the government. So this corporation, with people working for the CIA, a husband and wife, are making and distributing what they call French boots and Denver boots to immobilize cars. Forget just the illegal cars, but what would you do if there was a call to war or resistance or a military coup in this country? George Korkola, the partner of this, who was also arrested in New York City, the partner of Frank Terpil, has the Amtech Corporation, and for those of you who don't have the back tapes, they're a security system. You'll have to order the other tape, as I say, that makes security for Scotland Yard, for Exxon and Mobil Oil Companies, just a few. It's a large electronic security system, but according to this article, as the early articles, they work for the federal agencies, the United States agencies, and equip the Secret Service. They make security equipment, booby traps, bombs, firearms, and Korkola's lawyer said it was a legitimate work for the federal agencies. And his name is actually Korala, K-O-R-A-L-A, not Korkola. There's not a double K in there. I keep mispronouncing that name. The lawyer also says that the Amtech Corporation works for the Secret Service. It makes radiation detection devices. It protects the President of the United States. You see, we have these bombings in New York City of the Soviet embassy, the Cuban embassy, bombings at LaGuardia Airport, terror, blaming Falm Francis Tavern in New York City. Here are corporations that have such weapons, booby traps, firearms, bombs. Remember the ice cream truck that blew up in New York City and exploded on the street? And under the guise of being a protective device for the President of the United States, you have these unknown people with corporations, hundreds of thousands of dollars in buildings. Liberian Oil, it isn't linked to the Liberian Oil Company, but Liberia is where the oil tankers are registered overseas, and links to the international network of what I call the Odessa and the spy networks, a continuation of World War II, and assassination weapons and silencers and protection, and quote. So you can see how when Robert Kennedy was a candidate for presidency in 1968, and he's at the Ambassador Hotel, his security guard, Thane Caesar, was from Lockheed, and he can shoot a weapon standing behind Robert Kennedy and shoot from the ground up, hit him close to the ear, and then fall to the ground and shoot through his back. And the presidents, the candidates, are not protected. The very people that are, in quotes, protecting them, Secret Service and so forth, are linked to these international, well-funded organizations that have direct links to the Central Intelligence Agency. Technology Transfer and OCEANIC were both incorporated in 1977, right after Jimmy Carter got into Washington, D.C. They haven't found a legal connection between the two, but they have people responsible to both companies. And as I say, they work for Secret Service, presidential protection, the federal government, local police departments, and make weapons and bombs and booby traps. And that's just a part of the domestic United States links. There's international links that are much, much broader. There was a follow-up to that article, the January 11th article in the New York Times, January 17th, into some of the international connections of this group, these two men that were arrested. And also, again, it goes to the Central Intelligence Agency, the arms dealers, and the London connections, which also go down to Monte Carlo, and that, of course, was a can of worms with Aristotle Onassis and Hallmar Schacht, the band that financed and put Hitler into power, who had Onassis build the German and Japanese fleets after World War II and get back into the weapon industry at that end. For some of you, as I say, who are new at these tapes, I'm throwing out names and countries, and all I can do is A, apologize, and B, study some of the books and past tapes and try to catch up with this. The January 17th article, gun-running suspects are tied to a British dealer, and this is the New York Times by Mr. Apple, R.W. Apple, Jr. The British police sources said they have linked a Samuel Cummings, one of the world's largest private arms dealers, with two Americans. Now, the article later goes on to say that Samuel Cummings worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. Cummings was born in Philadelphia in 1927, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He set up Inter Arms in England in 1953. Mr. Samuel Cummings and his associates in Great Britain are not arrested or involved because the British investigation is, in quotes, dormant. They haven't broken British laws to send weapons all over the world. The British police have confirmed that these weapons belong to Inter Arms Corporation, the ones that Frank Terpil and George Korkola have, and that there's a network financed that sends weapons, as I said, to Libya and Uganda and the Palestine Liberation Organization. This international group is linked to two more people identified as Douglas Schlachter and Joe Cook Sands, who are not available. They were out of town, according to the New York Times, and an Ernest Ralph Warren. Mr. Warren, a little-known figure with wide connections in the arm trades, is a retired lieutenant colonel in the British Army. Early in the 1960s, he served as a military attaché at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. They're speaking of the years in which John Kennedy was assassinated when America had its coup. There's a case of Terpil, Korkola, Samuel Cummings, and Mr. Warren in Great Britain is another one of those great tips of the iceberg, and each little view gives us another piece of some of the missing puzzle sections that I'm trying to put together.
Generals, let's move fast. Your big chance is here at last. Now you can go out and get those reds, because the only good commie is one that's dead. You know that peace can only be one. When you're blowing them all, kingdom come. Sing it. 1, 2, 3, 4.
This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 425, January 25th, 1980, and this is side 2 of the tape. That little break in between tapes was also from Woodstock, and there's a song they were singing about Ronald Reagan, and the youth, of course, the musicians said and expressed the idea that they didn't have any enemies, that draft resistors had no enemies. The summer of 1969 is when the United States COINTEL program, the Operation Chaos, was being formed against the youth, and they were meeting by the hundreds of thousands at the rock festivals and making fun of people like Ronald Reagan. What happened was that the group was broken up, and one of the men singing in his song to Ronald Reagan in 1969, Graham Parsons, was just one of the 40 or 45 rock musicians. I have a list, and I haven't even updated the number, who I believe were murdered in a sequence after Woodstock and systematically done away. The drug case of Elvis Presley, if you read the records, began when he was stationed at an army base in Germany, and that's when they began supplying the drugs that multiplied until he was dead. And before I get back to the gun-running story of Mr. Terpil and Mr. Korkola in New York City, their arrest and their international gun running, I just want to say in these tapes, just at this moment, as good as any, some comments about the arrest of Paul McCartney in Tokyo. Of course, Japan and Germany were our enemies in World War II. They aligned up with the Trilateral to make war against the Soviet Union when World War II was over. The trip of Paul McCartney to Japan was a tragedy because out of bad judgment or whatever, he hasn't said the marijuana, the half a pound of marijuana, was planted. He's been in jail so far. He's got a sentence of 10 or 20 days, but the order is that no more Beatle music can ever be played in Japan. Nothing that he ever wrote for them, and none of the songs afterwards from his group Wings and so forth. So that with a half a pound of marijuana, they can keep an entire culture out of Japan. We talk about censorship in various countries and human rights, and this is totally ridiculous because everyone knows that the top movie moguls and political figures are all using cocaine and marijuana, and this was evidently sold to him. Actually, if he were smart, he would have let one of his aides carry it. John Lennon claims that his problems began because marijuana was planted in a binocular case in the house, and then the house was busted. But evidently this was on Paul. But this is a serious thing. Here's a man who made approximately $50 million last year, who's bought the movie rights to all of the major Broadway plays and musicals, who's a highly successful person, a genius at composing, whose music is played everywhere, and an entire country has said you cannot play any more songs of Paul McCartney's in Japan ever again. Now, they know that as the war escalates and the arms deals escalate, that the people are going to get out again, and they're breaking off those people that are symbols of gathering large crowds. The rock musicians are getting political. They're coming out and singing for a few candidates, but the real action isn't coming yet. I'm not talking about the establishment concert of Linda Ronstadt to raise money for the Cambodian people or Jerry Brown. I mean, the real hard political statements that were done, such as at Woodstock, and Graham Parsons, one of the three that was singing the song about Ronald Reagan, dedicated to Mr. Reagan, and claiming that he's a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Graham Parsons was just one of those that met a terrible death after Woodstock. And even after his death, the body was captured and cremated out on a desert. There's a long story to the Graham Parsons death. Graham Parsons was actually a wealthy boy who dropped out of the system and went into the anti-war movement in the Roxy and ended up at Woodstock. He had originally entered Harvard as a theology student and in the fall of 1965 and then began to get a lot of acid and then became emotional, and the acid changed his mind and his politics, but he had seen enough racism in the South and was fighting racism and became politically involved and ended up in Hollywood with the music industry, and also at Woodstock. He was popular in Woodstock, and as I say, he met this terrible death, and he was making fun of Reagan and the Klan in the summer of 1969 at a time where they thought to be anti-war is to have no enemies, and what they had was the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the entire establishment of this country watching him and them and getting ready for the warfare that these individual private arms people can do. And this is the important thing. These arms dealers are all over the world with corporations and dummy fronts and making bombs, booby traps, disseminating their poison acid, not the regular kind, the kind that can kill these people, drive them crazy, so that the combination of the weapons and the mind control can wipe out the entire culture of a generation that began in the 60s that was fighting a war that would be available to fight this war if they could get their rockers together. Men in Great Britain that are involved in this gun running haven't been interviewed. That Mr. Warren with worldwide connections, interesting name because E. Howard Hunt used the alias of Warren, and I think of Chief Justice Earl Warren and Warren Burger. Mr. Warren has worldwide connections, the retired Army colonel who was representing Great Britain in Washington at the time. John Kennedy was killed, who lives in England now. And Mr. Cummings, who has his international offices in Monte Carlo, who, according to the New York Times, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and supplies these guns for this large warehouse where they're available to people like Korkola and Terpil, who fly in and out of countries with multi-passports, wife makeup artists, property owned by unknown companies in Liberia, not registered in Virginia or Washington, unlimited money, unlimited weapons, passports, makeups, work for the Secret Service, works for the police department, the very agencies that protect the president, security for Exxon Scotland Yard, involved with international terrorism to make it appear like the left and to fund and arm the third world. This is a can of worms. I will update it. This is part 2 on those arrests. And each week that new information comes in, I'll fill you in on it. Now, what are these men doing? I've referred on various tapes to the missing gold, the wealth, the Nazi money that left Europe after World War II that is funding these organizations through gun running, narcotics, art objects that are being passed and sold off and transferred around, and just pure gold that's in vaults and banks. The answer to the effect that they're having in arming these third worlds and putting them into the narcotics traffic business instead of raising the standard of living of these countries is found in several articles that were in the paper just this week. San Francisco Chronicle this week had a quiz. They have 20 questions a week like the New York Times, and the question asked was, is that some diplomats are saying that the vote of Afghanistan in the United Nations marked a turning point in the history of the United Nations. Why? And the answer was the third world countries used to support the Soviet Union, the self-proclaimed foe of imperialism, in their votes in the UN Assembly. Monday, the developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America voted almost unanimously against Russia, whom they now fear. So when I talk about the third world being the Third Reich, we are funding them through a piece of the narcotics traffic and through the international gun traffic and so forth, to win the minds and hearts so that they become fearful of the Soviet Union. The New York Times had an article this last week. The UN used to be a place where the third world nations and the Soviet Union would gang up against the United States. But now the United States has discovered that the UN can be a policy tool, and it goes on to say that the United States succeeded, along with Africans, Asians, and most of Latin America, to block Cuba from a seat on the Security Council. The United States won 11-0 vote for economic sanctions on Iran, and they prepared to demand the Soviet Union to get out of Afghanistan. The New York Times article goes on to say that the third world is now working, and the United Nations appears to be working on our side against the Soviet Union. Now, this is a country that has been bombarded ever since their czar was kicked out. They've tried to push them against the wall, but with people like Terpil and Korkola, these international arms dealers of the intelligence community working from London and Morocco, and with the Liberian freighters and companies and unlimited money and corporations, that they don't have to account to anybody. They can pour money into those very countries that would be sympathetic to the Soviet Union, so that there is a symphony of all of them against the Soviet Union, and they represent our side and will help us wage that war to divide and break up the country known as the Soviet Union. Several weeks ago, I referred to the book Sabotage by Michael Sayers and Albert Kahn, the same men who wrote The Great Conspiracy. It was written in 1942 and posed the question about the bombs and booby traps and the fires and the chemical spills happening in the United States all over the country, in every city. If you save papers from around the country, there's just this massive kind of derailment of trains, trucks turned over, fires, and so forth. And the book Sabotage, written in 1942, talks about specific Nazi agents that were arrested for causing these kinds of violences during World War II. There's one chapter starting on page 99 to page 105 saying how many were sabotaged, and this had to do with particular ships. And it goes into the Normandy, the French ship that the United States used for troops at the height of the war. February the 9th, 1942, the Normandy went up in flames at 2:30 in the afternoon, and a massive amount of people injured and millions of dollars of loss, and it could be a troop transport. It took provisions, 2 weeks' provisions at a time, with 2,000 men abroad. And this book, The Sabotage, says that before France fell, as early as June 3rd, 1940, the U.S. Was told through various reports that there were Nazi spies in the United States, and that they should, in quotes, observe the Normandy, this $60 million liner. The Nazis were looking at her. And then the book Sabotage tells about Nazi spy Frederick Ludwig, who wrote articles in invisible ink about the Normandy that were sent overseas, and how he used to visit the waterfront to examine the Normandy, and how reports were done that there were opportunities for sabotage 2 months before it was burned. Now, they traced the office that was responsible for hiring the workers on the Normandy, this ship. It was run by a William Dreschler. He organized a company called Oceanic Service Corporation. And when I talked about Oceanic Corporation for Frank Terpil, with his worldwide Nazi connections in England and in the United States and New Jersey, my attention was called to the book which I had just finished getting and reading, this Sabotage. And William Dreschel organized Oceanic Corporation. He was their vice president. And in 1934, before the war started, he was arrested. He was out on bail and charged with being a Nazi agent in the United States. In 1936, he swore that he was owed allegiance to Adolf Hitler. And it was his corporation, if you would believe it, that had Nazi guards on the Normandy and Nazi spies. That the Oceanic Service Corporation supplied guards to the ships and warehouses and the piers in New York City. A man, William Dreschel, who organized Oceanic and was the vice president, was associated with 30 or more Nazi agents who were employed on the Normandy. So when that ship went down in 1942, over 250 sailors and people were injured. $60 million luxury liner was burned up. A source of supplies to Europe was gone. They knew in advance that this ship could be sabotaged, and yet on the docks, working at the shipyards, was a corporation that actually hired Nazis to stock this ship to send supplies over to defeat Nazi Germany. I feel that we are a conquered country, and that most people aren't aware of the massive amount of literature that illustrates the points which I'm trying to make, and that's why I pass these books to you and try to turn you on to them. I also referred, this January the 11th on tape 423, to George Orwell's 1984. He had a corporation called Oceania, which was America, Great Britain, Australia, and South Africa. One part of the world, 1/3, would be divided up, and this group would be in charge of the mindless workers, the elite that controlled, and the 13% of the outer party that carry on directives. That's tape 423. If you want to go back to the Oceanic Corporation, Oceania of Orwell, the Oceanic of Frank Terpil, and again the Oceanic Service Corporation that had Nazis that sabotaged the Normandy. Are there connecting links or direct connections between George Orwell writing for the British government, the service? He was very much a part of the British system when he was, before he wrote, as a young person. He was trained in the British government and they worked overseas in India and Burma for Great Britain, and then came back and wrote books. And there's an overlapping of names here and of situations and people who not only were related and worked in the past but are working today. And it'd be interesting to put in as many pieces of those puzzles and find out about the Oceanic Service that hired Nazis, that blew up the Normandy, and God knows what else, how many other things they sabotaged, and what happened to them, and are they still out, and did they set up the offices for Frank Terpil in Washington, D.C. in 1977 for the escalation of the war. Last week I ran out of time. I was talking about a book called The Bormann Receipt by Madeline Duke, published in 1977, same year that Terpil opened his offices in Washington. And her family were all killed by the Nazis, and they had an art collection going back to the 15th century that was taken away by the Nazis. And this book is the story of their looking for the pictures and trying to get them back and locating them in a warehouse in Germany, only to have them disappear again, and trying to find out who was buying these pictures or getting them, whose hands they were falling into. They had a famous Florentine lady by Botticelli and other well-known artists that you would know by name. And these pictures, I say, surfaced at one time in 1969, and then they disappeared. And the more they tried to trace it, they traced it to an attorney who was in the Hitler's Gestapo, using another name, an alias now of Dr. Archer, former Nazi, who defended the Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. And as they traced this, they came, of course, a document which they say is not fiction, which is true, which is signed by Martin Bormann, that he took over the Goering art collection and was responsible for the location or the movement of the treasures of art that were confiscated from all over Europe and put into the till of Nazi money. And in the book, The Bormann Receipt, there is a story of how Martin Bormann was in South America, staying with these colonies of wealthy and influential Germans who were living there, and his connections to the Nazi mafia and the people that were killed who would catch on to the links of the gun smuggling, narcotics, and art traffic. And in this book, it says in quotes, the Nazis have worked and are working for the fulfillment of one plan they've never abandoned, to fight Russia again. Next time, as allies of America and the Western world. This is the greatest political danger of Nazism in the 70s, is the combining of our former enemies, the Germans and the Japanese, and of course it's connected with their illegal arms traffic. The Nazi mafia makes great fortunes out of illegal armaments, while their activity is supporting subversive movements which are undermining democracy. The importance of the arrest of those men in New York City and their links to Great Britain and to South America, Monaco, all over the world is, I believe, this connection of what the Bormann Receipt talks about is the greatest political danger of Nazism of the 70s, connected to illegal arms traffic. The Nazi mafia makes great fortune out of illegal armaments which support subversive movements and are undermining democracy. You see, with these illegal armaments that are shipped, as I say, to the PLO, to Amin, to Uganda, even after Amin is out, to Libya, Iraq, all over the world, they undermine any chance of the so-called third world to get up on its bootstraps, because the gun running and the narcotics traffic and the money is put in the hands of a few who are willing to keep the masses down so that the third world cannot develop its schools, hospitals, education. The gap between the rich and the poor is greater, and there's more weapons and more narcotics, and there's more anti-Soviet feeling, so that the German, Japanese, Nazi connections working along with the United States get involved in these operations that are now turning all of their minds against the Soviet Union. The Bormann Receipt says another great danger to my country, it's in this book on page 235, is the Nazi narcotics traffic. There's little we can do about the young who are already addicted to heroin. We've got to protect children. We've got to stop the inflow of drugs from South America. We know the men responsible for the vile trade: Bormann, Altman, Ralph, Ricord, and a dozen other Nazi war criminals who are using the South American gun running and the narcotics traffic to keep the youth down, to keep them addicted, run by Nazi war criminals. And it goes on to say that the mafia in the world through the use of these techniques and these interconnecting links, will be the greatest danger to the world in the 1970s. Well, the 70s are over. This was written in 77, but the 80s now are going to feel the consequence of the combination of the glut of the narcotics and the narcotic wars between the various countries and the gun running, with the intent of the Nazis and the Japanese to flood the world with the weapons and the drugs and eventually get them on our side, get dependence on our side to fight Russia for that grand slam. This book talks about the Odessa, and I mentioned in another tape that one of the safe houses or inns that was bought for $500,000 from Frank Terpil was in Crewe, England, and in Crewe, England is one where one of the mysterious deaths took place for one of the men involved in that great train robbery in Great Britain that was funded. The purpose of the robbery was to put the money into the hands of Oskar Zeni, the head of the Odessa worldwide Nazi organization. Well, in this book on the Bormann receipt, it talks about the foundations for the Fourth Reich that were laid in 1944. The organization is the Odessa that helped the escape of prominent Nazis. They have commercial, financial empires all over the world, and they're educating and financing a whole young Nazi generation, the Bormann receipt said. They have their Black Order in Italy, where they bomb trade union meetings, and this is where the bombs and grenades could be going. In France, a Nazi movement that destroys Jewish cemeteries, a national front in Great Britain. Cemeteries are being desecrated all over the United States, particularly in Brooklyn, being torn up, and San Francisco areas being bombed and burned out now. This book goes into the art objects and the receipt. The Bormann receipt has to do, as I said before, with Martin Bormann signing that the art treasures and the gold would be used and put to Odessa to fulfill the dreams that they never abandoned to fight Russia again. The seeds have been planted since World War II, and as I say, all the headlines that we see are pieces sprouting out of the actions or activities of these combined groups to capture the Third World, to turn the Third World against Russia, to get the conscription going, to get the weapons going, to reinforce the CIA, and get ready this terrible tragedy of planning one war after the other. Now, I'm going to jump from the subject of the men arrested in New York City. I'll update it, as I say, as often as I can, and the Third World Movement to a book which is terribly important because this book puts in some of the little pieces of the puzzle that I keep talking about, and I want to bring out for the next week or two sections of this book. I don't know if it's hard to obtain, but I never see it on the stands. It's called Forces of Power by William Taub, published by Grosset and Dunlap in 1979. Now, William Taub's name should be a household word, but it isn't, and many of you probably never heard of it till this tape, so you heard it on this tape, and I'm going to give you a rundown of some of the things Mr. Taub is involved in. It will make your head swim, and then I'll detail them next week and the week after because, again, it links to Vatican art treasures and to counter-espionage and tons of gold that are in vaults in New York City, the transfer of gold, and mischief at the highest levels of government of these very people who are manipulating our lives all of the time. Now, the very first I heard of Mr. Taub was at the time of Watergate. There was just a little mention on a radio station. It wasn't in the newspapers, and I heard it on the radio. Roy Elwell was talking, or Jim Easton, I don't remember who, and it was in 1973, and I made a note. May 24th, 1973 is when I heard the name of William Taub, and it had something to do that he was working for Herbert Kalmbach, who was being investigated. He was Richard Nixon's bag man for assassination teams, for dirty tricks, and worked an attorney with the White House with Richard Nixon. And I briefly heard that Mr. Taub was found dead at a Swiss border, that he was beaten up. He was supposed to have had $2 million in a briefcase on him, and I typed up that information, and at the time, $2 million was an important amount. Dorothy Hunt was supposed to have $2 million when her plane crash went down in Chicago, and $2 million seemed convenient. There were other incidences of $2 million funds, and I heard on the radio just briefly that William Taub was found dead in Switzerland and that he had defended Jimmy Hoffa, had something to do with the Jimmy Hoffa case, worked for Herbert Kalmbach, and was dead. And I never could find out any more information about him. It wasn't in the newspapers. I didn't have any articles about him. This was in 1973. And the summer of 74, when I wrote for The Realist, the Senate committee, as part of the cover-up, I mentioned 8 people that had died with regard to the Watergate a year later. And in the footnote of that article on page 30, I had listed Mrs. Dorothy Hunt, Representative Mills, Colonel J. Webster, James Glover, Mr. Taub, Dennis Cassini, Mrs. Topping, Lou Russell. Those were the 8 people that I said a year later were primary witnesses to Watergate who had died. And I just said that Mr. Taub allegedly was working for Kalmbach, and all that I knew was that he had this $2 million and had died in Switzerland. But when I did an article, that was in 1974, I didn't have enough on Taub, and when I did the article for Midnight, July 12, 1976, it's called The Watergate Curse, 33 Witnesses Met Violent Death. I had the Watergate witnesses who died, but I didn't list Taub. I didn't have enough information at that time in 1976 to list him as a witness who had died at the time of Watergate, and it turned out that Mr. Taub had not died, and my judgment in withholding it later turned out to be correct. In this book, The Forces of Power, he does tell how they tried to kill him, how the CIA tried to kill him, and a complicated plot. He'd been involved making the movie Z about the Greek military junta, and of course, as I say, Roy Ash and our CIA had put the Greek military into power, and Micah Theodoricus, see if I can pronounce this, Theodoricus, the musician who wrote the music for Z, who was to get an award, was put in prison. And Taub had gone to Greece to get him released from prison, and he was not successful at the time. Later it was done, but they didn't want to link it to Mr. Taub's visit. He was released. But Mr. Taub described being picked up by a man named Brian Weiss and Randy Morrison, and he got into a car, and he did have a letter of credit for $2.5 million and documents, important documents about from Flor Trujillo, whose father was killed by the CIA in the Dominican Republic. And he was taken to Swiss Alps on a place called Murderer's Row, Chemin de la Lechère, and they said to him, "You work for the leftists," and because he had wanted to release this musician, and these men said, "We're going to kill you," and they put a rope around his neck, a garrote, and it was so strong, and beat him up. He almost lost an eye. He was almost blind, and he was choking and bloody from head to toe, and they choked him and threw him down the road and left him in the snow for dead. He said he was bloody from head to toe, and there was snow around him, and he crawled to the highway, and he just laid face down in the center of the road, hoping that somebody wouldn't run over him. They took him to a hospital in France, and then to Geneva, where he was taken care of. But the United States officials, he says, not a single official American would come to his aid, and the American embassy wouldn't, and they kept the briefcase. And the American press did not cover a story. There was no major wire service. There was no story about Mr. William L. Taub in any newspaper. I just heard on the radio, as I say, once, and it picked my ear. And so Tom Davis, who has the books at Research, I've given you the address where you can order these things, got this book for me. It wasn't advertised in any book clubs, and that's why I want to turn you on to it. There's so much material of missing pieces of what I've talked about in the past in this book called Forces of Power, and hopefully maybe he could get some for you. The men he knew who picked him up. They were allegedly friends that left him for dead. One was taken into Germany, and he escaped from a prison. Morrison was there and was put in a tight prison, one of the tight securities, and he escaped. Another one, Mr. Weiss, was out on bail, and Mr. Taub has important connections. He's been in the White House with President Eisenhower, with John Kennedy, with Richard Nixon, but nobody would tell him who put up the bail for Mr. Weiss. Eventually, one got 3 years and one got 2, and they're out. He was, for all purposes, left for dead, and the report was that he died in Switzerland. Of course, Gary Powers had his U-2 spy plane, which flew from Pakistan over the Soviet Union, and the instructions were to blow yourself up or take cyanide and die. And Gary Powers didn't die, and the Soviet Union proved that the weather reconnaissance plane was a spy plane. William Taub didn't die, and the stories he has to tell are so fantastic. Next week we'll go into them. They have to do with the Howard Hughes organization, with the murder of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, the escalation of the war. He claims Henry Kissinger is a Nazi. That's the first time I've seen it in print. Le Docteau told him in North Vietnam when he was there that Henry Kissinger was a Nazi. This is an amazing book. Get it if you can. Ask your libraries or order it from research. And I'm going to hopefully start next week's tape with the information in this book because it's a bombshell, and you could see why the intelligence community would have every reason to hope that Taub was dead, and you can see why he wrote this book after he survived the ordeal that he went through and the physical condition and the pains. You can see why he got this book published, and we should all be reading it for those pieces of the puzzle again that do fit into place of how the power movers move and what ends they go to get done the very things they want, which we eventually have to pay and suffer for. For Mrs. Mae Brussell and Carmel, have a good week, and I'll be back with you next week.
Pick down your books and pick up a gun.